Welcome to the third and final part of Chapter 10. Let's continue our discussion on comparing the US with other countries in terms of the ethical codes of conduct acceptable in each of these areas. Codes of conduct help provide guidelines and are developed within companies and also across countries. They are essentially a statement setting down corporate principles, ethics, rules of conduct, codes of practice, a company's philosophy concerning responsibility towards employers, shareholders, consumers, environment, or any other aspect of society external to the company. Based on your knowledge of the ethical differences between US and Europe, which area do you think is more likely to have a written down code of conduct? If you guessed the US, you are right. A survey that was conducted found that 75% of the US Fortune 500 companies had such codes of conduct, and the majority of the 189 European companies did not. These findings were taken as evidence of an ethics gap between the US and Europe. Differences within Europe were also found, with 50% of German companies having such codes of conduct, while only 30% of French companies creating codes of conduct. Differences are also found within the content of these codes. In US firms, it means treating employees with fairness and equity. For example, ensuring equal employment opportunity. For the French and the British, these codes basically stress the importance of the employees to the organization, reinforcing a sense of belonging and collective goals. In Germany, for example, these codes have things like rights of co-determination, shared responsibility, specific expectations that the company had of its employee with regards to reliability and loyalty. Thus, in other words, European codes focus more on employee attitudes and behavior towards the company, while the US focused more on company policy towards the individual employee. Which of these areas, the US or Europe, do you think is more likely to be vocal about ethics, or rather the lack of them, and why? If you guess the US, you are right. In the United States, private ownership and big business puts more onus and spotlight on company behavior. This is because public expectations of business conduct are very high, and this invariably results in a consistently high level of public dissatisfaction with the actual ethical performance of businesses. In fact, about 2/3 of the American businesses have actually found to be involved in illegal behavior, and the public love knowing about this. Indeed, public scrutiny of ethical behavior in companies has been made possible by an increased attention to these issues via the media. Journalists, for example, are increasingly becoming moral watchdogs of company behavior, and thus companies are increasingly living by the motto, "Don't do anything that you wouldn't want to read in the newspapers." Media attention is a lot more focused and harsh in the US than it is in Europe, because Europeans tend to view American morality as excessive, puritanical, and hypocritical. And thus, when so-called unethical things happen in lots of areas in Europe, they go unnoticed because people just don't think it's that big a deal. Thus, when considering the different cultural determinants of ethical behavior, institutional factors need to be considered as well. As already discussed, some of the institutional reasons might have to do with the roles of government and legislation, of the media, of stakeholders, shareholders, as well as consumers. For example, the more vocal concern for ethics in the United States may be due to stricter government disclosure laws and more active enforcement, as well as what we've already mentioned, the aggressive journalism and the litigative culture. Differences in legal context and the nature of regulation also play an important role in how ethics is seen in each country. In Germany, strict environmental laws make these issues very salient, yet there are very few laws against bribery or kickbacks and payoffs in the corporate sector. In Germany and France, bribery is illegal at home, but there are no laws banning German and French companies from bribing people outside of their national boundaries. In other words, outside of France and Germany, they can bribe whomever they want and not have to face any consequences in their home country. And thus, 55% of French managers and 38% of German managers are likely to use bribery if they feel it is needed. Managers in the US are bound to the 1997 Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which essentially bans US companies from using bribery as a means to conduct business, even outside the US, under penalty of facing punishment at home. And thus, only 14% of US managers dare to use bribery if they feel it is needed while undertaking international business. This law against using bribery inside or outside the US actually helped American managers. When Italy was conducting its investigations into bribery scandals, very few American companies were actually implicated. This was because they had taken the US anti-corruption legislation very seriously. At Honeywell Europe, the Italian vice president responsible for Southern Europe acknowledged that while upholding company principles regarding ethical behavior, sometimes it meant walking away from certain markets. But most managers in their company felt pride in being able to do this. But to what extent does imposing home country or company rules and ethics reflect what we call cultural imperialism, which is the my way or the highway kind of attitude, where a certain culture is assuming that they are right and everybody else is wrong, and everybody needs to follow one way, their way, versus when is it more appropriate to do like the Romans when in Rome, or what we call cultural relativism. Let's consider a statement released by Citibank. They said, "We must never lose sight of the fact that we are guests in a foreign country. We must conduct ourselves accordingly. Local governments can pass any kinds of legislations, and whether we like it or not, we must conform to it. Under these circumstances, Citibank can survive only if we are successful in demonstrating to the local authorities that our presence is useful to them." Which idea is Citibank trying to propagate? Cultural relativism or cultural imperialism? If you guessed relativism, you are correct. Citibank is essentially saying, when in Rome, be like the Romans. When we are guests in another country, we need to follow what that country is asking us to do and demonstrate to local authorities that a company's presence is indeed useful to that country. But cultural relativism can be extremely negative as well, because basically it assumes no set value system from which to operate. It has no moral compass. In other words, what you value will change completely when you're in one country to the next. So for example, if you don't bribe in one country, you might be completely okay with bribing in another country, which doesn't seem as bad. But consider racism. Maybe you think racism is not a good thing in your country and you would never do it. But if you go to another country and you're trying to be a cultural relativist and that country is following apartheid, maybe you choose to be racist because you're trying to be like the Romans when in Rome. And thus you have no moral compass or no way of really guiding you on what's right or wrong. Companies like Polaroid or GM chose the path of civil disobedience in the country of South Africa when it was operating under apartheid. They attempted to operate in ways to bring about social change by breaking the rules of racism and apartheid in that country. They insisted on their corporate ethic of racial equality and opportunity guiding them. Other companies, on the other hand, chose to play by the host country's apartheid rules for reasons such as those expressed by Citibank. Thus, as the case of South Africa demonstrates, different countries and different companies adopt different strategies when faced with ethical dilemmas. Indeed, some companies are so powerful that they can change the playing field altogether. Companies like IBM, for example, might be able to convince local governments to play by a company's rules or to not play at all. In other words, if you do not clean up your act, then we will not operate in your country. If you think of it, that's really another form of cultural imperialism, but perhaps carried out for the quote-unquote right reasons. Finally, let's talk about the different stages of ethical development that a company can be at. Companies can be either amoral, legalistic, responsive, emerging, or ethical. Amoral organizations, just as the name would imply, are driven by winning at all costs. They are driven by greed, by short-term orientation, and are essentially unethical organizations. Their approach to ethics is, we won't get caught and let's do whatever we can to make a profit, even if it's unethical. Legalistic organizations are driven by concerns for economic performance. Their approach is reactive. Let's not do any harm. Let's obey the laws to the letter. Let's avoid getting sued. These organizations usually do not codify ethics or write codes of conduct relating to ethics because they think it can create legal problems later on. Responsible companies, on the other hand, have a concern for balancing profits with ethics and the shareholder with other stakeholders. Nevertheless, these companies sort of see ethics as a means to make profits, not as an end unto itself. The fourth stage of the organization, the emerging ethical organization, demonstrates an active approach to ethics, providing support and measures to ethical behavior and encouraging people in the organizations to do the right thing. Finally, the ethical organization thoroughly integrates questions of ethical behavior with strategy, mission, HR policies, etc. that they develop and address fundamental issues of organizational integrity. Therefore, in terms of ethics, it is something they are rather than just something they do. Ultimately, the way these decisions are taken by companies and managers will all most likely remain culturally determined. Those from individualistic cultures, such as Americans, will look within themselves, asking if they can personally live with any decision that they've taken. Whereas those from a collectivist culture will look at those around them and ask, how will others live with them? In low context cultures, ethical standards are likely to be made explicit, to be found in writing and in law. And in high context cultures, ethical standards are likely to be more implicit, assumed to be shared by members of the community. The key is to recognize the similarities and differences between cultures with regards to their orientation towards ethics and the reasons behind these differences. The more these are openly discussed, the closer we get to reaching a shared understanding and operating from a mutually acceptable code of conduct when it comes to ethics. With that, we are done with chapter 10 and the lectures for this class. Don't forget to answer your question on D2L. Good luck with your presentations. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.